I'm Bill Wazer. I'm a Saskatchewan historian and writer, and this year's recipient of the Cheryl and Henry Kloppenburg Award for Literary Excellence. When I got the phone call, I must say I was pleasantly surprised. Upon reflection, I'm extremely honored, and it's also a little gratifying. It's affirmation that what I've been doing has resonated with readers and other writers. So I want to thank Cheryl and Henry for their generosity in sponsoring this award and for supporting Saskatchewan writers and the Saskatchewan writing community. I also want to thank the Saskatchewan Writers Guild for administering the award. They call for nominations, they arrange for the adjudication of the nominations, and they determine the award. I want to thank the Writers Guild for all they do and the things that are associated with administering the Cheryl and Henry Kloppenburg Award. I also want to thank my readers. Over the years, I'm often stopped in the streets. People send me emails. They want to talk about my writing. They want to talk about the history I do. They have questions, they have comments, and as a writer, that's extremely rewarding. I also want to thank Fifth House Publishers. I sent a manuscript to Fifth House over 30 years ago, and I remember the publisher at the time, Fraser Seeley, called me to his office after I submitted the manuscript, and he said to me, "You know, Bill, I thought it was going to be a real snower, but it wasn't, and we're going to publish you." And since then, 18 books later, I've been with the trade publisher, and I want to thank Fifth House Publishers, and especially Sharon Fitzhenry, the owner of the company with Fitzhenry and Whiteside. Finally, I want to thank my family. Being a writer means disappearing for hours at a time. At any time of the day, I will slip away to my writing office and be gone, literally, to another time, another place. And my family have become used to that. When I emerge, my bride Marley, 46 years and counting, will often joke, "Where have you been?" She is my biggest fan, my toughest critic, and we often sit over a glass of good malt and talk about the writing and where it's going and what the story might be. So thank you to my family. And thank you again to Cheryl and Henry Kloppenburg. I'm extremely delighted and pleased to be this year's winner. In 2005, I published A History of Saskatchewan for the province's centennial, and that book was publicly reviewed at a conference. It was sort of like a kind of public execution, as it were. But what was quite interesting about the discussion of that book published in 2005 is that a lot of people said, well, what about the front end of the story, before Saskatchewan became a province? Who's going to tackle that story? Because that's just as important. That was the gem for this book, A World We Have Lost, Saskatchewan Before 1905. And I worked at it in fits and starts. I wasn't really interested in doing it at first because it was quite a large project covering several centuries of pre-1905 history. But then I got down to work and I did the book, and I'm extremely pleased with it. So pleased that it in fact won the 2016 Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction, and that in itself was, I was gobsmacked by that. It was totally unexpected, and it was a wonderful surprise and a wonderful celebration of this book. So in doing something like this, how do you write something that will animate the story and engage the reader? And so I turned for inspiration to John Grierson. He's the father of Canadian documentary. And to paraphrase John Grierson, he said that film is the creative treatment of actuality. The creative treatment of actuality. So I took those words to heart in writing about the story before Saskatchewan, before 1905. And I tried to imagine the bison hunt by Métis on the northern plains, what it was like. And this is a section from A World We Have Lost, talking about the bison hunt. Led by a guide carrying a flag on a staff, the cart caravan, sometimes several miles long, slowly worked its way southwest across the plains. Advance scouts searched for the bison as well as kept a careful watch for the Sioux. There is no record of any Métis camp being routed. Never more than a few scouts were ever lost. Once a herd was located, camp was immediately set up nearby and everything readied. The chief led the hunters out to the herd, and it was only on his shout that they charged the startled bison. Each hunter guided his horse towards a particular animal, dropped the reins once close enough, and then fired across the saddle into the beast. He then rode after another animal and kept shooting and killing until any remaining bison were too scattered to pursue. The sounds of the slaughter saturated the air. The high-pitched cries of the hunters, the rapid pounding of the hoofs of the bison and horses, the constant blasts of gunfire, the whinnying of the horses with each kill and redirection, and the bleating of the bison, and the heavy, throaty breathing of those dying on the blood-soaked plains. Dust rose and enveloped the scene, adding a surreal quality to the killing field. It filled the eyes, nostrils, and mouths of the hunters, mixed with the taste and smell of blood and shit. What's really helped with my writing is working in radio, television, and print. I've learned that you need to make the reader care, and that's a question that I have in my head all the time. Why should I care? You want to make that connection with the reader and make that reader care. And so in the case of Who Killed Jackie Bates, it's a tragic story of a Depression family from rural Saskatchewan with a young eight-year-old boy, and the standard story is that the Depression made them form this suicide murder pact. They pulled into a rural schoolyard, left the car running, they climbed into the back seat and waited for death to overtake them. What I learned, though, is actually that Ted and Rose were an unhappy marriage. They didn't like each other and they wanted to separate, probably get divorced. But the one thing they wouldn't leave behind was Jackie. Neither one was willing to give Jackie, so he was sacrificed in this murder-suicide plot. I went back and I read the transcript from the trial because they survived this murder-suicide plot, but not Jackie. And so this is what happens. They're in the back of a car in a rural schoolyard in December 1933. The gray Chevrolet coach was running for perhaps an hour. That's when Rose, dragged from her sleep by Jackie's sharp coughing as he threw up a bit of supper. Ted was hacking and snorting too, trying to clear his throat and nose after puking all over his coat and down the side of the seat. Rose, confused and feeling sick herself from the smell of Ted's vomit and the exhaust fumes, managed to get up and shut the motor off. She then crawled unsteadily back under the covers. Ted, Rose, and Jackie lay there for some time. It could have been several hours. When Rose finally emerged from her gas-induced haze, she could feel the cold all around her, but for a few moments she wasn't sure where she was. Then the realization hit her, and she automatically turned to Jackie, asking him if he was okay. When he didn't answer, she reached for his hand. It was cold. Rose gently shook the boy as if it would rouse him, but she was too late. Jackie was dead. When Rose was coping with the shock of her son's death, she was body slammed by another terrible thought. Maybe Ted was dead too. She vigorously shook her husband's arm, willing him awake. I was afraid he was dying, she recounted, and I'd be left alone. Ted had survived, though only barely. When Rose finally managed to rouse him, he seemed to be in a deep trance and could hardly move his arms and legs. He just sat there in the dark, zombie-like, with vomit down his front and a trickle of blood running down the corner of his mouth because he had bitten his tongue. A frantic Rose pleaded with her husband, Ted, I'm not going back without my boy. Do something. Finish me off too. I don't mind what you do. In Search of Almighty Voice, Resistance and Reconciliation is my most recent book. It's something of a departure for me in the sense that I work closely with an Indigenous community, the One Arrow First Nation. It's the story of Almighty Voice, at one time regarded as one of the most wanted criminals in Canada. But the story bothered me. It didn't make sense, the popular story. So I went back and I consulted the original Northwest Mounted Police in Indian Affairs records. And more importantly, I worked with the One Arrow First Nation. I met with Chief Tricia Sutherland. She introduced me to a direct descendant, Peter Almighty Voice. I presented Peter with tobacco. I talked about the project. He accepted my tobacco. He told me it was a good thing I was doing. I also worked with the One Arrow elders. They meet every first Tuesday of the month, and I was a frequent guest at those gatherings. So I took the official record, understanding the biases that are inherent in those records, and I also collected oral history from the One Arrow community. And the result is In Search of Almighty Voice, Resistance and Reconciliation. The book describes why Almighty Voice resisted, and that's important to understand, but it's also a reconciliation story. We need to recognize some hard truths about Canada's colonial past before we can go down that road of reconciliation. And so this is from the conclusion. This is from the last page of In Search of Almighty Voice. Almighty Voice was not prepared to surrender to a stultifying existence where the One Arrow Reserve was little better than a prison farm, where band members faced punishment and hunger unless they followed the directives of the Indian agent and farm instructor, and where there was no independence of movement. It's a wonder that more young men did not attempt to throw off the yoke of government control. That the graves of One Arrow, his grandfather, and Almighty Voice lie today within sight of one another is only fitting, and a constant reminder of the failed treaty relationship with Canada in the late 19th century. Indeed, Almighty Voice remains on the lips of One Arrow band members. There is a quiet respect for the young man that includes the naming of the local education center in his honor. But his story has been largely forgotten beyond the reserve over the past few decades and is generally unknown to Canadians today. Just the mention of his name elicits questioning looks. That's a shame. There can be no reconciliation without memory. In 2005, I published Saskatchewan: A New History, and I had the distinct pleasure of presenting the first copy to Queen Elizabeth II during her tour of the province during the centennial year. I presented the book to her, and Prince Philip had a look at the title, and he sort of sniffed and he said, "Oh, a new history. What's wrong with the old history?" My response to him is that there wasn't something necessarily wrong with the old history, but we moved on, and there are new sources, new approaches, and new ways of looking at Saskatchewan history. So I had to take Saskatchewan history over 100 years and boil it down to one book, all regions, all peoples, all periods. And the device I used to hook the reader and get them to, identify with the story and want to move on were stories. We tell stories with our family, we tell stories with our friends, whether it be a coffee or a drink. And I learned that stories are a wonderful way to springboard into larger stories. So this is how I started the chapter on the Great Depression. And there's the picture that accompanies this story, and it's a classic picture from the 1930s. This is how I opened it. They were the poster family of the dirty 30s. In late June 1934, Abram and Elizabeth Fair and their 7 children, one of them a 3-month-old baby in his mother's arms, were stranded in Edmonton's Market Square, barefoot, hungry, and broke, when a newspaper photographer captured their utter desperation and what would become one of the most enduring images of the Depression. Just 2 years earlier, the Fairs, Mennonites from the Nuanlaga colony north of Saskatoon, had sold everything they owned, bought an old car, and headed for a new start in Alberta's Peace River country. But life in northern Alberta was little better. Their first crop was hit by frost. The following year, the Peace River flooded. Anxious to return to Saskatchewan, the Fairs started for home 1 month after baby Peter was born. For the next 8 weeks, they battled mud, breakdowns, and constant hunger. Abram worked at local farms along the way to earn a few pennies to feed his starving family and buy gas for the car. By the time they reached Edmonton in late June, Elizabeth was too weak to nurse her baby. 2 city police constables found the family and took them to the station, where the Salvation Army gave them food and clothing. The next day, before the Fairs continued on to Saskatoon, a photographer for the Edmonton Journal snapped a picture of the family standing in front of the car and trailer. The Fairs epitomized the desperate plight of prairie families in Saskatchewan during the Great Depression, victims of forces largely beyond their control. And that's the device I use. I tell that story as a springboard into larger events, larger themes, larger stories, and it makes the connection with the reader.